Daniel Carter walked into the bar looking for nothing more than a cold beer and 30 minutes of silence after a 10-hour shift at the plant. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the jazz lounge, and the air inside smelled like whiskey, wood polish, and something warm from the kitchen. He noticed her the moment he stepped past the doorway, a woman sitting alone near the far end of the bar, dressed like she belonged somewhere far more important than a quiet lounge on a rainy Tuesday night. She was strikingly beautiful, composed, and completely still, seated in a wheelchair positioned neatly beside the bar stool no one had offered to move. Daniel, never one to overthink a joke, smiled and walked closer without a single ounce of hesitation. "Don't tell me you're my blind date," he said, half laughing, expecting a polite eye roll or maybe no response at all. The woman lifted her head slowly. She studied him for a moment, unreadable, and then a faint smile crossed her lips. "No," she said. "I'm the woman who has canceled 33 blind dates because every single man walked away the moment he saw this chair." Daniel felt his stomach drop. The noise of the bar seemed to fade for a second, replaced by the quiet weight of her words. He opened his mouth, searching for something clever to say, but nothing came. 10 minutes later, without fully understanding why, he found himself sitting across from her, 2 drinks between them, and an entire conversation waiting to unfold. He had no idea that the woman in front of him was one of the most powerful executives in the entire city, a name printed across business headlines and quarterly earnings reports. He only saw a stranger who had just told him the truth in a way no one else ever had. The city outside had settled into that particular gray hush that autumn brings before winter fully arrives, the kind of evening where streetlights flicker on early, and everyone seems to walk a little faster toward wherever they are going. Daniel had spent the better part of the afternoon fighting with a set of specifications that refused to make sense no matter how many times he recalculated the tolerances, the kind of stubborn problem that follows a person home even after the computer screen goes dark. He was not a man who complained often, but by the time the clock struck 6, he felt every one of his 39 years pressing down on his shoulders like a weight he had carried for far too long without setting down. Daniel had clocked out at exactly 6 in the evening, exhausted from double-checking blueprints on a project that refused to cooperate. 2 of his co-workers, Mark and Tony, had invited him for drinks at the usual sports bar down the street, the kind of place with loud televisions and cheap nachos. Daniel had declined, telling them he needed something quieter, something with less noise, and fewer people shouting at a football game. He drove a few blocks farther than usual, and parked outside a narrow jazz lounge he had passed 100 times but never entered. The place was dim, lit with amber bulbs, filled with the low hum of a saxophone drifting from a small stage in the corner. He ordered a beer and let his shoulders drop for the first time all day, scanning the room out of habit more than curiosity. That was when he saw her, sitting near the end of the bar in a wheelchair, dressed in a deep green blouse that made her look like she had wandered out of a magazine. Nobody approached her. Nobody even glanced her way twice, as though the chair beside her had become an invisible wall keeping the rest of the world at a careful distance. Daniel assumed she was waiting for someone, perhaps a date running late or a friend caught in traffic. He almost walked past without saying a word, but something about the way she sat there, poised and unbothered despite being clearly ignored, pulled him toward her instead. He leaned against the bar a few feet away and made the joke before he could stop himself, the words slipping out in that easy, self-deprecating tone he used whenever a room felt too quiet. Her answer landed like a quiet blow, honest in a way that startled him more than any raised voice ever could. He did not apologize excessively, did not stumble over a dozen sorry statements the way most people might after such a comment. Instead, he simply asked if he could sit down, and she nodded once, as if giving him permission to prove whether he was different from the 33 men before him. The bartender brought over 2 more drinks without being asked, clearly familiar with her order, and the 2 of them began to talk the way strangers sometimes do when neither expects anything to come of it. Their conversation started slow, the careful back and forth of 2 people testing whether the other was worth the effort. Daniel told her about growing up outside the city, the son of a mechanic who taught him everything he knew about engines before he ever set foot in an engineering classroom. He mentioned his marriage without dwelling on it too long. a relationship that had once felt permanent until it quietly fell apart under the weight of two people who stopped choosing each other. His daughter lived with her mother in another state now. And though he missed her fiercely, he had learned to carry that distance without letting it show on his face every day. Victoria offered less, her words measured and precise. The practiced caution of someone who had learned that oversharing came with consequences. She admitted, almost reluctantly, that she despised the way people looked at her lately, a mixture of pity and discomfort dressed up as politeness. She hated the sympathetic tilt of a stranger's head, the overly careful tone people used when speaking to her, as if kindness required treating her like glass. Daniel listened without flinching, without asking the question everyone else always asked first. He never once brought up her legs, never asked what happened or how long she had been in the chair, questions that seemed to hover behind every other person's eyes the moment they noticed her. Instead, he asked if she liked jazz, gesturing toward the trio playing near the stage, and something in her expression softened for the first time that evening. She admitted she loved the way a saxophone could carry sadness and joy in the very same note, and for a moment, she looked less like a woman guarding herself and more like someone simply enjoying an evening out. Daniel confessed that he had never been much of a music expert himself, that his taste ran more toward whatever played on the radio during long drives, but something about the atmosphere of the lounge had drawn him in from the very first note. Victoria explained, with more animation than she had shown all evening, how her father used to play old jazz records on Sunday mornings while making breakfast, filling their small apartment with the sound long before she understood anything about the genre. She said the music had always felt like a kind of permission, a reminder that sadness and beauty could exist in the very same breath without canceling each other out. They talked about music for a while, about the strange comfort of a slow piano melody on a rainy night, about how certain songs seemed to understand grief better than people did. Victoria laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded and quick, the kind that surprised even her. Daniel noticed it immediately, the way her whole face changed when the walls came down even slightly. He found himself hoping the night would stretch on longer than it reasonably should have. Then her phone buzzed against the bar top, and she glanced at the screen before answering with a controlled, clipped greeting. Her voice shifted instantly, dropping into a tone Daniel had never heard from her, sharp, authoritative, entirely in command. She spoke about a contract renegotiation, mentioned numbers that made Daniel's eyebrows lift slightly, and issued instructions with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed without question. When she hung up, she offered no explanation, simply apologizing for the interruption and steering the conversation back to safer topics. For a brief moment, he wondered whether he should simply ask her outright who she was, whether the abrupt shift in her voice belonged to a job title she preferred to keep private during an evening meant for escape rather than explanation. He decided against it, reasoning that a woman who had spent her whole night avoiding the pity of strangers likely did not want to spend the rest of it defending her career instead. There was something quietly respectful in choosing not to pry, in letting her decide, on her own timeline, how much of herself she wanted to share with someone she had only just met. Daniel felt a small flicker of curiosity he chose not to voice, sensing that pushing too hard might close a door that had only just opened. They talked for another hour, about books she barely had time to finish, and cities he had always meant to visit, until a black SUV pulled up outside the lounge, and a man in a dark suit stepped out to open the door for her. Victoria said goodnight politely, thanked him for the conversation without offering her name in full, and allowed the driver to wheel her toward the entrance. Daniel watched from his seat, bewildered by the sudden formality of her departure, the quiet efficiency of a routine clearly rehearsed many times before. He sat there a while longer, nursing the last of his beer, wondering exactly who she was and why the question suddenly mattered so much to him. The next morning, Daniel stood in his kitchen making coffee, the television murmuring in the background, as he scrolled through nothing in particular on his phone. A business news segment interrupted the weather report, the anchor announcing that Victoria Sterling, chief executive of one of the country's fastest-growing technology firms, had just closed an $8 billion acquisition deal. The photograph on screen showed the same woman from the night before, poised and confident, seated in her wheelchair at the head of a boardroom table, surrounded by executives twice her age. Daniel nearly dropped his mug, coffee sloshing over the rim as he stared at the screen in disbelief. The woman he had joked with over drinks, the one who had answered his careless comment with such devastating honesty, was one of the most powerful business figures in the entire city. He set the mug down slowly, replaying their conversation in his mind, searching for any hint he might have missed, any clue that should have told him who she really was. Across town, in an office overlooking the skyline, Victoria sat behind her desk long after her assistant had gone home, unable to focus on the reports stacked neatly in front of her. She kept thinking about the man from the bar, the easy way he had spoken to her without flinching, without softening his voice into that careful, pitying whisper she had grown to despise. He hadn't treated her like something fragile or broken, hadn't stumbled over his words, trying to prove how comfortable he was with her disability. He had simply talked to her, the way anyone would talk to another interesting person they had just met. For the first time in longer than she cared to admit, Victoria found herself thinking about someone outside the walls of her carefully controlled world. She had built an empire from nothing, survived a boardroom full of men who doubted her the moment the accident changed her life, and learned to trust almost no one who approached her afterward. Yet something about Daniel Carter refused to leave her thoughts, a stubborn warmth she hadn't felt in years. Against every instinct that told her to stay guarded, she made a decision that surprised even her. She returned to the same jazz lounge 3 nights later, telling her assistant only that she needed an evening without meetings or phone calls trailing behind her. She wore something simpler this time, less like an executive and more like a woman hoping to be seen as ordinary for a few hours. Daniel arrived not long after, having found himself returning to the same bar more often than he could explain, half hoping and half denying that he wanted to see her again. When their eyes met across the room, neither pretended surprise, the pull between them too honest to disguise as coincidence. This time, there was no careful testing of boundaries, no polite surface conversation meant to fill silence. They spoke about the books that had shaped them as children, the cities they longed to visit before life got too complicated, the small failures that had quietly taught them who they eventually became. Victoria mentioned a novel she had read 3 times over the years, and Daniel confessed he had never finished it, prompting a debate that carried them through 2 more rounds of drinks. She laughed more that night than she had in the past 3 years combined, the sound surprising the bartender, who had grown used to her quiet, controlled presence. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest as well, the heaviness of years spent guarding himself against disappointment slowly beginning to ease. The staff at the lounge began to notice the pattern, whispering to one another that the striking woman with the wheelchair and the easygoing man with the tired eyes seemed like they belonged together, whether either of them realized it yet or not. The bartender, a quiet man named Robert, who had worked there for nearly 2 decades, started reserving the same corner table without either of them asking, sliding a candle onto the surface, as though the small gesture might somehow protect whatever was blooming between his 2 regular customers. Victoria noticed the thoughtfulness and left him a generous tip each time, though she never mentioned it directly, preferring instead to let her gratitude speak through small, quiet actions rather than grand declarations. Daniel noticed it too, and found himself grateful for a place that had, without either of them asking, become something like a sanctuary from the rest of their separate, complicated lives. There were nights when they said very little at all, content simply to sit beside each other and listen to the trio play some slow, aching melody neither of them could name. Victoria told him once that silence with the right person felt entirely different from silence with everyone else, less like absence and more like company. Daniel understood exactly what she meant, having spent years after his divorce mistaking loneliness for independence, until he realized how much lighter an empty room could feel with someone simply choosing to remain in it. Weeks passed in a rhythm neither of them planned but both quietly welcomed, evenings at the lounge turning into longer conversations that stretched past midnight. Daniel knew Victoria had money. That much had been obvious from the moment the SUV pulled up outside the bar that first night. What he did not fully grasp was the scale of her world, the billions attached to her name, the empire she had built from the wreckage of an accident that could have destroyed anyone else. One evening, Victoria invited him to dinner at a restaurant he had only ever seen photographed in glossy magazines, the kind of place where reservations were booked months in advance. Daniel showed up in his old pickup truck, the same one he had driven since college, parking it awkwardly among a row of luxury vehicles outside the entrance. He wore his best shirt, pressed carefully the night before, unaware that a photographer stationed nearby had already captured the image of him stepping out of that truck. By morning, the photograph had spread across every major business outlet in the city, paired with headlines questioning why a billionaire executive was seen dining with a blue-collar engineer driving a rusted pickup. Commentators speculated endlessly about her judgment, about whether she was slumming it for attention or simply making a reckless personal choice unfit for someone in her position. The story spread faster than either of them anticipated, turning a quiet dinner into a public spectacle neither had asked for. Financial columnists who had never once met Daniel wrote entire pieces speculating about his motives, some suggesting he was chasing money, others insisting he must be some kind of publicity stunt orchestrated by a struggling engineering firm hoping for attention. Talk show hosts joked about the mismatch during their morning segments, framing the story as an oddity rather than two adults who had simply found something honest in each other. Daniel avoided reading most of it, though a few of the crueler headlines found their way to him regardless, forwarded by well-meaning friends who thought he should know what people were saying. At his old workplace, co-workers who had once shared lunch breaks with him now whispered behind closed doors, unsure how to treat a man suddenly thrust into a story none of them fully understood. Some treated him with a strange new deference, as though proximity to Victoria's wealth had somehow elevated his worth overnight. Others grew distant, uncomfortable with a colleague who no longer fit neatly into the ordinary rhythm of their working lives. Daniel found the whole experience isolating in a way he had not anticipated, caught between two worlds that both seemed to view him as an outsider. Victoria's board of directors called an emergency meeting within days, several members expressing open concern that her personal life was becoming a distraction from the company's carefully managed public image. Shareholders murmured about stock volatility, about optics, about whether her judgment could be trusted if she was willing to risk her reputation over a man from outside her world. One of the older board members, a man named Harold Whitfield, who had sat on the company's founding committee, spoke with particular bluntness, arguing that public perception mattered as much as quarterly earnings when it came to maintaining investor confidence. He suggested, not unkindly but firmly, that Victoria consider how the relationship might be framed as a liability rather than a personal matter beyond the company's concern. Other members nodded along, some out of genuine conviction, others simply following the loudest voice in the room, until the meeting concluded with an unofficial but unmistakable expectation hanging in the air. Victoria sat through the meeting with practiced composure, though something inside her twisted uncomfortably at the thought of losing what little happiness she had only just begun to rediscover. That same week, sitting together in her penthouse after the storm of headlines had begun to settle, Victoria finally told Daniel the truth about the accident that changed everything. 3 years earlier, she had been driving home from a late meeting when another vehicle ran a red light, slamming into the side of her car with enough force to shatter her spine in 2 places. She spent months in recovery, learning to accept a body that no longer moved the way it once had, grieving a version of herself she would never get back. Her fiancé at the time, a man she had planned to marry within the year, ended the relationship less than 2 months after the accident, unable to imagine a future that included a wheelchair. Friends who had once filled her calendar with brunches and vacations slowly stopped calling, uncomfortable with a version of her they no longer knew how to relate to. Every date she attempted afterward followed the same painful pattern. Men who seemed interested until the moment they saw the chair, after which their enthusiasm quietly evaporated. She described the weeks in the hospital that followed. The endless procession of doctors delivering updates in careful, clinical language designed to soften news that could not truly be softened. She remembered staring at the ceiling of her hospital room for hours, replaying the sound of the impact over and over, the screech of metal and the sudden silence that followed it, a silence she still heard sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep. She had built her entire identity around control, around being the person who solved problems rather than became one, and the accident had stripped that identity away in a single unbearable instant. Daniel listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening at the thought of anyone treating her with such casual cruelty. When she finished speaking, he asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment. Quiet and sincere. "Did it hurt?" he asked, that day, when it happened. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, something breaking open behind her eyes. No one had ever asked her that question before. Not her doctors, not her family, not even the fiancé who had once claimed to love her completely. Every conversation about the accident had always circled around logistics, recovery timelines, insurance claims, adjustments to her office and her home. Nobody had ever paused to ask about the pain itself, the fear she felt in those seconds before everything changed forever. She began to cry, quietly at first, then more freely than she had allowed herself in years, the weight of 3 years finally finding release in front of someone who had simply asked the right question. Daniel did not try to fix it or offer empty comfort. He simply stayed beside her, letting the silence between them hold space for everything she had never been able to say out loud. It was, in its own quiet way, the most intimate moment either of them had experienced in a very long time. The peace between them did not last long once the media caught wind of the deeper story unfolding beneath the surface. Reporters began digging into Daniel's past with an intensity that felt almost predatory, uncovering details about his divorce, interviewing his ex-wife for quotes she likely never intended to give in that context. His workplace received calls from journalists asking about his character, his reliability, his suitability for someone of Victoria's stature. His ex-wife, caught off guard by a reporter outside her home, offered a comment about their failed marriage that was twisted into a headline, suggesting Daniel had a history of running from commitment. His co-workers grew uneasy, unsure how to act around a man suddenly thrust into a spotlight none of them understood. Daniel found himself defending his own life story to strangers who had never met him, exhausted by a scrutiny he never asked to invite. The board of directors escalated their pressure on Victoria, presenting her with an ultimatum dressed up in careful corporate language. Either she distanced herself from Daniel entirely, restoring the company's controlled public image, or she risked a vote of no confidence that could threaten her position as chief executive. Victoria sat through the presentation with a calm exterior, though the ultimatum shook something deep within her. It was never about the money for her, never about the title or the power she had fought so hard to build over the years. What frightened her most was the growing realization that her presence in Daniel's life was actively destroying the peace he once had, dragging him into a world of scrutiny he never wanted. She lay awake many nights weighing the cost of staying against the cost of watching him unravel under a pressure that was entirely her fault. Daniel noticed the toll it was taking on her, the tightness in her shoulders, the exhaustion behind her eyes that no amount of makeup could fully hide. He watched the news coverage pick apart his character night after night, watched Victoria's board circle closer with each passing week, and made a decision he believed was the only way to protect her. Without a dramatic confrontation, without accusations or tears, he simply began to pull away, choosing distance over the slow destruction he feared was coming for both of them. Within days, Daniel changed his phone number, informing only his closest family members of the new one. He submitted his resignation at the engineering firm where he had worked for over a decade, citing personal reasons he refused to elaborate on further. He packed a single bag and left the city entirely, driving north toward a small town where nobody recognized his face from the headlines that had dominated local news for weeks. Victoria discovered his disappearance the following morning when her calls went straight to a disconnected line, panic rising in her chest in a way she hadn't experienced since the accident itself. She sent people to his apartment, only to find it emptied out, his landlord confirming he had left without any forwarding address. For the first time since building her empire from nothing, Victoria Sterling felt completely powerless, her money and influence useless against a man determined to vanish. She hired investigators, called in favors from contacts across multiple states, yet weeks passed without a single lead on where Daniel had gone. At night, alone in the vast penthouse that had once felt like an accomplishment and now felt merely like an empty container, Victoria found herself replaying every conversation they had shared, searching for the exact moment things had begun slipping away from her. She wondered whether she had said something wrong, whether her hesitation during the board meetings had somehow convinced him she valued her position over him, though nothing could have been further from the truth. Sleep came rarely during those weeks, and when it did, it offered little comfort. Filled instead with fragmented dreams of empty bar stools and unanswered phone calls. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Rachel, who had worked alongside her for nearly 5 years, noticed the change immediately. The uncharacteristic distraction during meetings, the way Victoria's eyes would drift toward the window during long stretches of silence. Rachel never asked directly what was wrong, though she began quietly rearranging Victoria's schedule to allow for more unstructured time, sensing that her employer needed space to grieve something she had not yet found the words to name. The board, satisfied that the distraction had resolved itself, quietly dropped the pressure they had been applying, treating the situation as a problem that solved itself. Victoria, however, found no relief in their satisfaction. Only a hollow ache that grew heavier with each passing day. One rainy evening, almost by instinct, she found herself back at the jazz lounge where everything had begun, sitting in the same spot near the end of the bar where Daniel had first spoken to her. The bar stool beside her remained empty, though something about the space felt different now, weighted with memory rather than isolation. The pianist, an older man who had played there for years and had grown fond of watching their story unfold from his little corner stage, approached her table with something in his hand. "He left this for you," the pianist said gently, "a few weeks back, before he disappeared. Said you'd come looking eventually." He handed her a folded envelope, worn slightly at the edges from having been carried for some time before it was left behind. Victoria's hands trembled as she opened it, recognizing Daniel's handwriting immediately, careful and deliberate. The same way he spoke when he meant every word he said. The letter began simply, without dramatic flourish, exactly the way Daniel always communicated. "I didn't leave because of the chair," he had written. "I want you to know that clearly, because I suspect a part of you might believe that's the reason, and I couldn't bear for you to think that. Even for a moment, I left because I watched what my presence was doing to your life, the pressure, the headlines, the boards circling like vultures, waiting for you to fail. I couldn't stand being the reason you might lose everything you built after everything you already survived. I told myself that leaving was the noble thing to do, the selfless choice, though if I'm honest, it felt more like running than sacrifice. I think about that first night constantly, the way you answered my careless joke with the truest thing anyone has said to me in years. I think about the sound of your laugh at that dinner. How it made the whole restaurant feel quieter somehow, like the world had softened, just to listen. I don't regret a single moment we spent together, only the way I chose to end it, without giving you the chance to decide for yourself." Victoria read the letter twice, her tears falling freely onto the paper, blurring some of the ink near the bottom. She folded it carefully, tucked it into her coat, and asked the pianist if he knew anything more about where Daniel might have gone. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Daniel had spoken once about a small town near the mountains, a place with a cabin he had inherited from his grandfather years earlier. The pianist mentioned that Daniel had spoken of the place only once, almost in passing, describing quiet mornings spent fishing on a small lake near the property when he was a boy, long before responsibility and heartbreak had filled the space where that simple joy used to live. He remembered the way Daniel's voice had softened when he talked about it, the same way people speak of somewhere that still feels like home, even after years of absence. That small detail became the only real clue Victoria had to work with. But it was enough to set her investigator searching through property records across 3 different counties. It took her 2 days to track down the exact location, working with an investigator who finally uncovered records of the property under Daniel's grandfather's name. She arranged for a car early one morning, telling no one at the company where she was going, needing this particular journey to belong entirely to her own choice rather than any calculated plan. The drive took nearly 5 hours, winding through roads that grew narrower and quieter the farther she traveled from the city she had built her life around. When she arrived, she found Daniel outside a modest wooden cabin, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in grease as he worked beneath the hood of an old truck parked in the gravel driveway. He froze the moment he noticed the car pulling in, disbelief crossing his face as Victoria's driver helped her out and wheeled her slowly across the uneven ground toward him. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The only sound, the quiet rustle of wind moving through the surrounding pines. "You didn't have to come all this way," Daniel finally said, wiping his hands on a rag, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified by her sudden appearance. "I didn't come here because I need saving," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through it. "I came because I need someone to stay, not someone to run every time things get difficult. I've had enough people leave me because they thought they were protecting me, or protecting themselves, and I'm tired of being treated like something that needs to be handled carefully." Daniel dropped the rag and crossed the distance between them without another word, kneeling in front of her wheelchair so their eyes met at the same level. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, pulling her into an embrace that carried the weight of every unspoken fear either of them had been carrying since the letter was written. Victoria held onto him tightly, finally allowing herself to believe that this, at last, might be something worth trusting completely. Inside the cabin that evening, Daniel built a fire in the old stone hearth his grandfather had laid by hand decades earlier, the flames casting warm, flickering light across the wooden walls. Victoria watched him work, struck by how natural he looked in that setting, so different from the polished boardrooms and marble lobbies that made up the rest of her existence. They ate a simple dinner of soup and bread at a small table near the window, talking quietly about nothing important, savoring the strange, fragile peace of simply being together again without an audience watching every move. They stayed in that small cabin for nearly a week, away from headlines and board meetings, and the noise of a world that had never fully understood either of them. Daniel told her about his grandfather, who had built the cabin decades earlier, teaching him everything about patience and craftsmanship long before engineering school ever entered his mind. Victoria told him about the years before the accident, the ambition that once drove her relentlessly, and the strange gift the accident had ultimately given her in teaching her who truly belonged in her life. When they finally returned to the city together, Victoria walked into the boardroom, sitting in her chair at the head of the table, with the same composure she always carried, though something in her had visibly shifted. She informed the board plainly that her personal life was no longer a subject open for negotiation, that her judgment as chief executive had never once wavered because of who she chose to love. Several members shifted uncomfortably, though none dared challenge the resolve now evident in her voice. A full year passed, carrying both of them through changes neither could have predicted the night they first met in that quiet jazz lounge. Victoria remained at the helm of her company, her leadership stronger than ever. The acquisition she had closed the same week they met now recognized as one of the most successful deals in the firm's history. Daniel, with Victoria's quiet encouragement, opened his own engineering consulting firm, specializing in accessible infrastructure design, a field he discovered he cared about deeply after everything he had learned from loving her. The same board members who had once pressured Victoria to end the relationship watched, over the following months, as her leadership only grew steadier, her decisions sharper, her presence in negotiations more commanding than ever before. Whatever fear had driven their objections quietly dissolved under the evidence of her continued success, and several of them eventually admitted, in private conversations they never expected to have, that they had misjudged the situation entirely. Victoria never sought an apology from any of them, content simply to let her results speak on her behalf, the same way she always had. Daniel's new firm grew slowly but steadily, built on a reputation for genuine care rather than flashy marketing, word spreading among architects and city planners who valued his attention to detail. He hired 2 employees within the first 6 months, both of whom he trained personally, passing along the same patience his grandfather had once shown him in that same mountain cabin. He kept his old pickup truck, refusing every suggestion that he traded in for something newer, insisting it had earned its place beside him through the whole complicated, wonderful mess of the past year. Their story had become something of a quiet legend among people who followed both business news and matters of the heart, a reminder that resilience and love were not mutually exclusive concepts, Young employees at Victoria's company sometimes mentioned the story quietly among themselves, treating it less like gossip and more like proof that even someone at the very top of an organization could choose honesty over convenience when it mattered most. A few of them, inspired by what they had witnessed, began speaking more openly about their own struggles, whether visible or hidden, no longer as afraid of being defined by them within the walls of the company. Victoria noticed the shift and found unexpected pride in it, realizing that her personal life, once treated as a liability, had quietly become something closer to a gift for the people around her. Neither of them sought attention for it, though the story found its way into interviews and profiles regardless, often framed as an example of authenticity triumphing over public pressure. Victoria, once fiercely private about her personal life, found herself occasionally willing to speak about it, though always on her own terms. At an annual gala honoring outstanding leaders in business, Victoria stood at a podium accepting an award for her contributions to the technology industry. The room filled with executives, reporters, and members of the very board that had once pressured her to abandon the relationship entirely. She spoke about resilience, about rebuilding after loss, about the quiet strength required to keep leading a company through uncertainty. Near the end of her remarks, her tone softened, shifting from the polished language of business into something far more personal. "The most remarkable thing," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd before finding the one person who mattered most, "isn't when someone finally notices your strength despite your struggles. It's when they simply forget you ever had something to overcome in the first place, because to them, you were never broken to begin with." The camera in the room turned toward Daniel, seated near the front in a well-tailored suit, his expression carrying the same easy warmth that had first drawn her to him months earlier. He smiled, the very same smile that had opened their story with a careless joke in a quiet bar on a rainy night. "Don't tell me you're my blind date," he mouthed silently across the room, the private joke only the two of them fully understood. Victoria laughed softly into the microphone, the sound carrying warmth rather than performance. "Yes," she said simply, before adding, almost under her breath but loud enough for the room to hear, "and this time, forever." The two of them left the gala together later that evening, walking slowly beneath the soft glow of golden lights lining the entrance of the building. Passersby glanced at them the way people always had, though the nature of those glances had changed somehow, curiosity replacing pity, admiration replacing discomfort, as though the city itself had slowly learned to see her the way Daniel always had. Victoria's wheelchair moved beside him, steady and familiar, no longer a symbol of everything she had lost, but rather a quiet reminder of everything she had ultimately gained. It stood, in that moment and every moment after, as proof that genuine love was never born from perfection, but from the simple, deliberate choice of two people who learned to see each other fully, beyond every limitation the world tried to place between them.